Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. If I could have your attention, please. Big crowd here. Thank you everybody for coming. It's my first time at this conference, so I really had no idea what to expect. But wow, the room's packed. My name is Davido Profe. I specialize in teaching conversational Spanish and English, and I'm located in Denver, Colorado. So made the drive over yesterday, and very excited to share this information about teaching conversational proficiency with you today. So just real quick, if anybody wants me to send them the presentation, I know you can download it from the website for the conference, but feel free to email me, david@thelanguageschool.us with the subject Top 10 Tips for Teaching Conversation, and that way we can stay in touch after the conference. And this is also my email address and full contact information on social media and all that fun stuff as well. Well, I'm just going to kick things off by showing you a quick little video of one of my students, Jazz, that's been studying with me for about a month now.
Hi, my name is Jazz Zaccarelli. I'm originally from Chicago. I've been studying with Duolingo for about 7 years, on and off. And within 3 lessons of the language school, I feel more comfortable introducing myself than I've learned essentially from Duolingo. I would highly recommend it. Oops. Hi, my name is Jazz Zaccarelli. I'm from
So I just wanted to show that to you because that's the power of teaching through conversation, right? That's what students typically want. And they really love the program. As he said, he feels more confident in just 3 lessons than after 7 years with Duolingo. So just quick little survey of the room. Is everybody here a current teacher? Pretty much. Anybody thinking about joining the teaching profession? Anybody thinking about starting a private language business to teach Spanish or English in your area? Okay, like a teacherpreneur. Okay, cool. So I'd love to talk with you afterwards because that's what I do in Denver. So I just like to start with the end in mind. These are my top 10 tips, and I've only got an hour with you today. It takes a little bit longer than that to go through all of these tips. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit you with all 10, and let me know if there's anything in particular that calls your attention that you definitely want to make sure we cover today. So for my first tip, you should learn a second language yourself if you're teaching people how to speak a second language. Focus on your students is tip number 2. Make sure your students understand you. Comprehensible input is key. And I think relevant vocabulary should be the initial focus for students in their first 90 days of language acquisition. And I'm really big on doing everything from the perspective of a conversation, not those fun verb charts that we're all used to working with, right? But actually looking at the way a conversation works and then teaching it that way to make sure that the students are learning that way. Tip number 6 is to get your students talking from the very first lesson. Tip number 7 is to show your students how to study and practice in between classes. Tip number 8 is easy on the grammar. I think there's a time and place for grammar, but kind of have to ease your students into it, right? That's for perfecting the language, not necessarily building up confidence when speaking the language. Number 9, stop talking. And this is a hard one for teachers, right? We're used to talking, and I've found over the years that it works best when I say hardly anything at all in class. And number 10, if you can, find your students native speakers so that they can practice with outside of class. Is there anything in particular anybody wants to make sure we talk about here?
Number 7.
Number 7, show your students how to study and practice between classes. Perfect. Any other special requests?
I need to learn how to stop talking.
I think we all do.
Cool. All right, well, let's jump into it then. My first tip is pretty self-explanatory, right? You're not teaching somebody the language, you're teaching them how to speak a new language. So I think it's really important that people go through this process themselves, especially as adults, just to help you build that empathy up with your students, right? To know what they're going through. If you're monolingual and you're teaching somebody to be bilingual, you've missed a key component. You haven't gone through that acquisition process. So I think it's really important to be empathetic for your students, so you're not getting frustrated. And I've seen teachers like, oh, why can't they get it? It's like, well, you haven't gotten it either, so you can't get frustrated with your students. And when you've gone through that process, then you know exactly what your students are going through. And then personally, I believe it's incredibly powerful to teach students in their native language, especially true beginners that don't speak any of the language at all, and to teach them in a way that they can understand you, right? So I'm a big proponent of using somebody's first language to teach them their second language, at least in the first 90 days. Pure immersion, I think, works wonders once you've gotten up to kind of an intermediate conversational capability. But from my own experience of having moved to Spain before I spoke any Spanish at all, it was a nightmare. And I don't wish that upon any of my students. And I think it just, eliminates the need to play this creative game of charades in your classes when you can just say, oh, table is mesa, right? Like, in 2 seconds your students get it instead of having to act out that scenario. All right, number 2 is to focus on your students. And the reason why I teach conversational Spanish and conversational English is that I think that's what students want to learn. They want to learn how to speak the new language, right? They're most interested in getting confidence when they're speaking. And I work a lot with students and high school students. In my adult classes, they're all learning it for work, right? I live in kind of a bilingual community. In my neighborhood in Denver, it's about 70% native Spanish speakers and 30% Americans, right? So there's this huge need to actually speak Spanish while they're at work and speak English while they're at work. So I give my students what they want. So I think that's the first component of developing a conversational program is having that understanding, right? That's actually what your students want. Reading, writing, grammar, it all has its place and it's all important. And I would never say that that's not important, right? But I think at least in my experience, and from my own journey of trying to learn a new language, I wanted to learn how to speak the language. And I found myself quite confident when going in to take my Spanish exams in college. And then when I'm hanging out at a party with some of my Latino friends and I can't even say, hola, me llamo David, right? So that was frustrating in my own experience. I found this to be really helpful when I'm working with my students, is to develop a deep understanding of exactly who I'm working with, is to actually create a student profile, right? So has anybody ever done this before, where at the beginning of the year they actually write down who their students are? Cool. So I think some things that are important is to understand their nationality, right? And their first language. And I say that especially because sometimes people think, oh, well, Spanish is the main thing. But Spanish changes a little bit, right? The culture changes a little bit. I've lived in Spain, Argentina, Chile, and Ecuador. And each country was a completely different place than the last one, right? So culturally speaking, I think that's really important. It's a good idea to understand what their educational background is. So I know a lot of you are working in primary schools, high schools, that sort of thing, yeah? Is anybody working with adults at all, or, yeah? So just understanding, I teach Spanish to a lot of Americans that have college degrees, master's degrees, and I teach English to a lot of students that haven't made it past the 3rd grade, and migrated here and came over here, and it's a completely different world teaching somebody that has a very solid educational background versus somebody that doesn't. And it's 100% possible for both groups to learn the language when you cater to that, right? So you can build that stuff into your program. Age is interesting because adults learn pretty differently than children learn. And also their own experience with the language, their reasons for learning, and their level, right? Their current level. So the reason why is when you have this understanding, it really helps you to motivate your students, build their self-confidence, and reduce their anxiety levels, right? Is everybody familiar with like Krashen's second language acquisition theory and the affective filter? So I never even knew what this was. I just built this program based on my own experience, and I started reading his book, and I was like, wow, that's what I do in my classes. So super important for language teachers to know that. I talked a little bit about using a student's first language to teach their second language. And again, back to that effective filter, right? It really reduces their anxiety when they're in a class where they can understand what's being taught. And I've noticed I get complimented all the time from my ESL students especially. They're just so grateful, and I think they tell me that it inspires them. You know, hey, this guy has learned how to speak our language, so that motivates me when it comes to learning English. Like, I know I can do it because he did it backwards, and it's just a very good motivating factor. Now, you can, or students can develop that into kind of like a crutch, right? And then they become dependent on that. So this is kind of an art, right? There's a time where you really need to turn that off, you know? So I'm a big proponent in the first 90 days of using it. And then, you know, when and where necessary. Every now and then I'll get asked a question in my advanced classes, you know, students that are fully conversational, but they're just missing that one little vocabulary word, right? So I might throw it in there or try to describe it, you know? So I think you have to be careful with it, but it is an asset. And then when you understand the reasons for learning, it helps you to make the classes relevant, right? The more you're teaching your students relevant vocabulary that they're actually using to talk to each other in a day-to-day basis, it's gonna help them get that confidence much faster. So especially if you can develop kind of a specialty or a niche, like if you're teaching business English to business professionals, if you're teaching high school, you know, try and make it a lot more about fun activity. You know, what do kids do on the weekends? What are they talking about? You know, teach them how to talk about their fun activities and, you know, TikTok videos and, you know, the things that all the high school kids are doing, right? So it'll just help you kind of engage with your students a little bit better that way. All right. So focusing on my students, I want to introduce you to Jason, that is from Colombia. He's currently in high school. He's going into his senior year of high school. And instead of me telling you about him, I'll let you listen to him.
Bill Prove here, and I'm with one of my students, Jason. Hi, Jason. So, Jason, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your experience with me. First, where are you from?
I am from Colombia.
Yeah. And what do you do for work?
I am a student. I am legal.
Okay, good. So, you're a student in what, high school? In high school? Okay, good. What was the problem you were having with English before you discovered the language school?
The problem is so I can't communication with the American.
Okay. And what did that frustration feel like while you were trying to communicate with Americans?
I feel really bad because I can't communication with the persons in my school, in my work.
So you were having this challenge with your teachers at school, with your classmates, at your job. I can imagine that's very difficult. What was different about the language school?
The language school is different because you teach me about communication with the Americans and the culture.
Very good. Take me to the moment when you realized that you were actually learning how to speak English.
Communication with my coworkers.
Okay. Yeah. So you, at work, you started being able to talk to your coworkers.
Yes.
Wow. So now I have to ask you, how long have you been studying English with me?
It's 2 months.
For just 2 months. And how was your English before? What level did you start in?
So,
Yeah, so you really didn't speak practically any English before 2 months ago, and now you feel really okay, good. What is life like now that you can speak English with people?
Communication with the persons in the street, in the school, in the work.
Well, there you go. That's after 2 months of English classes with me. Thank you, Jason. Keep up the good work.
So I like to do these little interviews with my students every now and then because when I'm talking to language instructors, frequently they complain about how long it takes to get their students there, right? You know, in my own personal experience, I studied Spanish for 2 years in high school before I moved to Spain. And like I said earlier, I didn't speak any Spanish when I got there. I enrolled in a full-time program right after that, and it took me about 2 more years before I started feeling like I was confident when I was speaking with people. I could do written tests and I could fill in the blanks and I could, you know, ace all my tests, but when it came to actually introducing myself to somebody, I couldn't do it. And, you know, I think the average teacher, like the studies show, it takes, you know, anywhere from 2 to 5 years to develop a real aptitude with the language. But when you focus on actually teaching conversationally, it happens a lot faster. Now, you heard him making mistakes, right? He said communication instead of communicate. Little mistakes like that, but I think he was able to effectively communicate with me. And he described just this nightmare scenario where he was a junior in high school. They moved from Colombia and he got thrown into the regular program. They didn't give him any specialized ESL classes. He didn't speak any English, and he was just humiliated being at school, right? So he studied with me over the summer, and his brother is still in classes. He's got an older brother, and his brother just says he's so much happier right now because he's learned that foundational communication ability, right? Let's see here. It was 0.7, I think somebody requested. So I just want to make sure I can hit that for you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, for sure.
When you were working with that young man, was this a one-on-one situation or was it in a group class?
Group class.
How many people?
So I tend to work with smaller groups. And I think in his class there were about 4 students.
Okay.
So really, really small class. That said, this methodology does work in larger classes if you can kind of break students into smaller groups, right? So somebody wanted to talk a little bit about showing your students how to study and practice, right? And this is, again, thinking back to when I was in college studying Spanish, where you got the textbook, you got the workbook, you went to class, and you might every now and then repeat a word after the teacher, and then the teacher says, okay, now go home and do your homework and study. And most people go home and they don't know what that actually means, right? And so the way I started was going through my book and flipping back and forth across the pages and filling in the blanks, and every time there was a word I didn't understand, I had to go back to the glossary in the back. And you know, I remember after my first college class, it took me about 4 hours to do my homework, and I was working full time, and I just realized that was never gonna work, you know? So I think when it comes to learning anything, especially a language, as teachers, we can really only do this first part, right? We're there to teach, but you know, second language acquisition can't be taught theoretically, right? Like it happens subconsciously. And so I think what we have to do is try and guide our students down the path of least resistance, right? I always joke with my students, I can only teach you, it's up to you to learn. But I do try and go above and beyond and share my own personal experiences and exactly what I did in order to learn how to speak my second language. So kind of full circle, you've got instruction, comprehension, study, practice, and then repetition, right? You have to repeat a lot. I do have a study guide that I share with all my students, and it's free. I'm happy for you to download it, but I give a lot of advice of exactly what to do outside of class, right? Because you only have your students for an hour at a time, but it takes a lot longer than that to really learn the language, right? Some study tips that I always go over with my students from day number one, and I constantly go back to it, is I'm a huge proponent of flashcards, right? There's been a lot of studies that say, in the past 10 years or so that have come out, that say it takes approximately 1,000 words to become conversational. Just as long as they're relevant words, right? They have to be relevant. Relevance is the key there. And there may be better ways to do it. I don't know, but I know it worked for me, is just using flashcards. But I like to show my students exactly how to use those flashcards, right? Because students still don't even necessarily get that, right? My practice with flashcards is, so if I'm teaching Spanish students, they start by trying to understand the language, right? And this is the way that I have a 6-year-old son, and it was fascinating to see him learn how to speak his first language, because it happened exactly like I had studied, you know? You first develop an understanding. So the lesson for your students is when they're working with flashcards, look at the side with the new language first, and try and think about what that means in their native language, right? So if you would start by looking at the Spanish card, and if it says mesa, you want to try and say to yourself, oh, that means table, right? Go through it. Anytime that you get something wrong, you put it in the back, you keep repeating it, and then after you've done that, then you flip it over, and now you get into the language production, right? And so then they do essentially the same thing. And then I really stress the importance of starting with very small stacks, 10 to 20 words at a time until they get the hang of it, because it's just overwhelming if you try and do that full 1,000 words all in one day, right? But if you start with 10 to 20 words at a time, I try to coach my students on focusing on 10 new words a day. And 10 new words a day adds up to 1,000 words in approximately 3 months, right? So it's actually not that overwhelming, and it's totally manageable for them to do. And then ideally, they're doing this 2 to 3 times a day for 2 to 3 days in a row, because you need constancy and consistency to really, you know, take it one step further from memorization, but internalization, where mesa is no longer Spanish. It's just another word for table, right? You don't even know that it's a different language. So when you go through that process, it works really, really well. It's very efficient. And then I like to also accompany that with reading activities and other practice activities that they can do when they are at home in between the classes. Does anybody else have any study tips or something that they would want to share with everybody here? I mean, this is just my experiences, right? But I don't know everything.
A question: when you do flashcards, are they physical flashcards or digital flashcards?
So it depends. If I'm in person, because now I teach both in person and online. If it's in person, I like to do it in person. We actually make the flashcards together, and we do this as an activity. And if I'm ever teaching classes and the students aren't keeping up the way that they should be, I go back to that activity, because in my past 20 years of learning languages and past 15 years of teaching languages, it all goes back to the vocabulary. If they're not keeping up with class, it's because they're not internalizing the vocabulary, right? So if I'm in person, I do it with physical flashcards. If I'm doing stuff online, I use Quizlet. Any other questions about that? Was that helpful to somebody requested it here? Yeah. Okay, cool. And then I think somebody wanted to talk about not talking, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I don't have a lot to say. This is, again, more of an art than a science, I think, and it's really uncomfortable for teachers to do, right? Because we feel like we're supposed to be talking. We're teaching the class, right? So we should be talking. But I think learning a new language requires the students to be speaking the new language, right? That's just the best way. And I've got some other slides if we have time to talk about kind of the physiological and neurological responses that are happening. But the goal here is to try to stop talking, right? Get your students speaking at least 80% of the time, but rightly so, this is one of the hardest concepts for teachers to master, right? So when I'm doing this, and I didn't start doing this, right? Like this is just something I've experimented with over the years. But when I get to a new concept that I'm teaching, right? I explain it, but then I try and turn it over to the student. So I have conversational activities that we do where just as long as I'm in group classes, if I'm in a large group, I split them into groups of about 3 to 4 students. And then I have them do the conversational activities together. I walk around and I listen to each table just to make sure. I let them know that I'm there to help them out with it if they have questions. But I really try not to do the ask the questions or answer the questions myself unless I'm giving an example, right? And I think this is super important, to compliment your students frequently, right? I'm a big fan of Dale Carnegie, and I think his words are to be lavish in your praise, right? To win friends and influence people. So I really try to be, lay those compliments on my students and correct them very minimally, Errors tend to correct themselves over time, right? Students, when they're, unless it is prohibiting understanding, I don't like to correct them, right? On their pronunciation, maybe initially a little bit more than later, but students hear it said the right way and they correct themselves over time, right? So I think that's kind of the key to my correction process, is if it's understandable, like Jason in the video, right, where he said communication instead of communicate, if I were to stop him and correct him there, it's gonna make him feel bad, potentially, but eventually he's gonna hear somebody say that and say, oh, silly me, I've been saying communication, right? So I think just as long as people are understanding the conversation, you don't have to correct people so much. So I'd invite you to think about this over the next couple of weeks as you go back to the classroom. I know you're gonna consume a lot of information here today, but notice yourself while you're in classes and think about that. And a good activity to do, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but as you see my camera phone's over there, I'm recording myself with this presentation. Has anybody ever recorded themselves teaching their classes? It's fascinating to actually go back and watch the recording and say, wow, I can't believe I did that, right? Okay. Question?
Yes. So when you are having your students to talk more in class in the targeted languages, how do you get them not to revert back to English? So when you're working with a particular group, you got 3 other groups over here and they're talking about what they're doing on the weekend and all that. How do you get them to stay on task?
Yeah, so, it's not perfect, right? Kids, especially the younger they are, they're harder to kind of focus and concentrate on the task. But I've found, because I've developed these conversational activities in a way that's really fun and engaging and practical, that they don't do it, right? And if they do it, I'm quick to, come up and say, español, por favor, right? Like, you can only prompt them to do that, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes they revert back to their native language, and, if you go back to understanding who your students are, individual personalities are going to have a lot to do with this too, right? Some people are going to be really introverted and shy and timid, and so speaking, public speaking can cause them nightmares, right? And doing that in their second language makes it even harder. But that's why I like to split them into small groups. So instead of saying, okay, yeah, come up to the front of class, Stacy, and tell us about your weekend, right? That's just like terrifying. I read one of Krashen's papers on this, and he was describing talking to his neighbor that had to take a Valium or a Xanax to go to her community college Spanish class. He said, why are you taking that Valium right now? She said, oh, I have to go to Spanish class. That was the level of anxiety she had, because she said that, you know, the teacher's gonna call on me and I don't know what I'm saying and I'm so miserably uncomfortable that the only way I can do this is by taking an anxiety pill, right? But yeah, I think, you know, a lot of times when you have classroom management issues, behavioral issues, disruptions, it gets back to, you know, if they're feeling like they're accomplishing something or not, right? And by having the conversational program in place, where it doesn't even seem like class most of the time, honestly, because they are talking about what they're doing on the weekends, right? That's what the activities are designed to do, just to help them do it in the new language. But yeah, slight prompts when necessary, but try not to go overboard with it, I'd say. You know, going back to that effective filter, just as long as they feel comfortable.
So I have a question on that. So
Yes.
do you give them like chat mats to talk through, or what do you do to, if you're having all these groups and you can't be in all those places at one time? Or
Yeah.
have you introduced it as you spoke? I mean, how did you?
Yeah, so I've created all my lesson plans through PowerPoint presentations, and then I show them on the screen.
Okay.
So they're all looking at the same thing. It's also in their student workbooks that they can also kind of follow along with if they need to. But they'll have like, you know, I introduce, you know, this is how you speak the new language, this is the conversational exchange that takes place, and here are 10 questions that you can kind of take turns asking each other these questions, right?
Right, so it's not a prescriptive conversation up on the board, it's like here are phrases that you can use in your conversation.
It's open-ended questions. I do have some pre-scripted kind of conversational exchanges, like if I'm teaching my students how to buy something at the store or how to order food at a restaurant, right? But for the most part, I've just spent a lot of time developing conversation starters on my own and thinking about, you know, what is it that people talk about, and then there will be like a list of 10 open-ended questions that they just go back and forth.
And how did they get the input initially, though, I guess, is what to be able to say those things?
So I introduce those when it's appropriate, right? Obviously, I don't do it from lesson number 1, but at about my 4th lesson is when I start introducing that. When I teach, and this is in here, I guess I should just go ahead and talk about this, right? So, easy on the grammar. Grammar has its time and its place, right? And we all know about this verb chart, right? And this is what I learned, and of course I had the vosotros in there. I don't put that in there nowadays, but I had to learn the vosotros too, right? And so most Spanish teachers from day number 1 or very early in start talking about these are how regular verbs work, and we're gonna do the yo form that ends with o, the to form with as, blah blah blah, right? And this is grammar, and that's fine. It is the way the language works, but it's overwhelming and unnecessary for the students initially. So in my first month, all I do is work with the to yo form, right? And I show them this is the mechanics of a conversation, right? A conversation is an exchange of information, of ideas and information. And, you know, you have to get good at asking questions, understanding questions, and then responding to questions to become conversational. And if you think about it, in most of your day-to-day interactions with people, and especially if you're a brand new student of the language, that's all you're going to be using, right? People aren't going to ask you to tell them all about your, you know, best friend and third, you know, you're just going to be stumbling through those initial kind of conversation starter type questions, right? So I just break it down in my first month of classes and only teach the to and yo form, because you need to ask questions, you need yo to answer those questions, right? And this takes me all of 5 minutes to teach to my students, I would go through a little verb chart activity just with Duolingo, and I take about 10 verbs and just get them comfortable saying that, right? And they've now been taught what the verbs mean. They understand the verb endings, and then that's when they get that list of 10 questions that are designed with the same verbs that I just taught them, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. So grammar's great, I love grammar. Obviously, I'm a language teacher, and I think it's really important for perfecting the language. But again, I'm most interested in kind of those first 90 days of language acquisition and building up that confidence in my students. There are certain things that have to be taught grammatically because they're just grammar topics, right? Like, I've yet to figure out a really good way to teach articles without breaking down the grammar behind it. But then I do tie it into like a conversational activity of buying something from the store, right? So even when you do teach grammar, then you go right back to the conversation and you show them how to use it in a conversation. All right, so kind of going back now to the comprehensible input stuff, right? I think this is really important, and it gets overlooked a lot. When I was learning Spanish, I had 2 years of high school Spanish and didn't accomplish much, so I've, like a lot of people, I said, okay, I've got to move to Spain. That's the only way I'm gonna do this, right? And, it was a fascinating experience. I wish I could say it was an amazing experience, but I was pretty miserable, right? Because I didn't understand my teacher. My teacher didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Spanish. And the idea behind this is, if you don't understand something, you're not gonna learn it, period, right? Understanding is key to learning. If you wanted to learn how to become a mechanic and went to a guy from China that was only speaking Mandarin, how comfortable would you feel putting together that engine the next day? I certainly wouldn't want to do that, right? And I don't think it makes much difference with learning languages too, Full immersion has its place at the right time, but initially I really want my students to feel comfortable. If we go back to the effective filter and reducing anxiety levels, So making sure your students understand you is really key, and everything else is just noise, right? This is what I felt like my Spanish teacher in Barcelona was teaching me. That entire month, blah, 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 David, entiendes, blah, blah, blah. So this is crashing, right? This is clearly the most important input characteristic. It amounts to the claim that when the acquirer does not understand the message, there will be no acquisition. In other words, incomprehensible input or noise will not help. And this is from page 63 of his book on principles of practice in second language acquisition. There's a time and a place for immersion, right? But they have to have those 1,000 words of vocabulary, right, before they can understand enough of what you're doing. And I've seen a lot of teachers that just jump in from day number one. There was a great video I just saw on YouTube the other day of a Spanish teacher that was, really ripping into one of her students. It was obviously a satirical video, but this guy shows up to his first day of Spanish class, and she's saying, no, aquí vamos a hablar español. Tiene que hablar español conmigo. And the guy says, this is my first day. No, así no me vas a hablar. Tiene que irte de la clase. And the guy just keeps saying, I have no idea what you're saying, right? So I think this is super important for teachers, and I think there's, increasingly we're coming to understand this a little bit better, and doing these types of conferences are really important because, I don't know, I just had bad experiences with immersion, too early on, and I was this close to giving up on learning Spanish because I was so miserable. I like this guy a lot. He's got a good book out. I think it's called The Third Ear. But somebody sent me this TED Talk back in about 2014. And he was kind of ridiculing the TED Talk because this guy's claim is that anyone can learn a language in 6 months. So another teacher friend of mine said, get a load of this guy, isn't this ridiculous, you know? And I started listening to it, and I actually became fascinated. And this, you know, after listening to it, it kind of became the basis of my program. So that's where I got that number of 1,000 words. One of my mentors is Bryce Hedstrom. He's presenting right after this, I think, in the same room. His number is 800 words. I've seen others say it's 1,200 words, but kind of in that range is what we're looking for to become conversational, because most people spend most of their time talking about the same thing over and over again, right? Every now and then when we're talking to somebody new, we go into some hypothetical conversation or start talking about something outside of that range. But if you think about what you do for work, especially as language teachers, right? We literally go in and have the same conversations every single day. So the tricky part is helping people find this relevant list, right? Because it's different. I already mentioned that that's just 10 new words a day for about 90 days, 100 days. And that depends on the learners. Here's my thing about flashcards. I already talked about that.
Question, sorry.
Yes, sir.
How do they monitor their growth as far as when you're observing them? I know in class, we'll look at our students' speaking abilities, we'll kind of put them on a rubric, so to speak, or measure them what proficiency level are they at. Do they have, like, key attainments or objectives? I can talk about this, I can describe this is the breadth, my cohesion, my vocabulary, my comprehensibility. Do they kind of monitor themselves?
Yeah, actually tomorrow I'm giving another presentation on evaluating conversational capabilities. I do have a test that I can give, and it's just a conversation that I walk through with students. It's, you know, predetermined questions, and I just walk through, and that's how I'm able to do it. And I do give tests at the end of every level I teach. I give a test that's more for confirmation. Because when you're teaching conversationally, you know, they're either going to be able to have the conversation with you or they can't, you know. You can guess your way through a test, through a written test, especially a multiple choice test. But you can't fake a conversation, right? You're going to look at me like a deer in headlights, or you're going to get it and you're going to respond to me. So, you know, I don't think there's any program that's flawless out there. Too many different types of learners, too many different types of personalities and circumstances. But I would say I probably have about an 80% success rate with my students where they pass from one level to another. And, you know, I give the test. I always explain to them, this is just to confirm it, and it's because, you know, conversation isn't tangible, like you can't see it, right? You just feel it, but you can't see it. So I give them a written test to kind of confirm that they're getting it on paper. And if they're making mistakes conversationally, they typically make the same mistakes on paper, and so that way I can kind of show them, hey, you really need to step it up in this area, you know. But the true test is the practice. It's the actual class time where you're conversing with them. You know, like Jason said in that video that I showed you, he was able to go into work one day and start talking to his coworkers, you know, and he couldn't do that before.
What kind of growth do you expect as far as going from like a novice high to intermediate low or mid, or when you measure as far as timing? I mean, with hours, I know it's different in a classroom, but like so if I say, hey, I want to learn Spanish from you, what's my expected growth and proficiency after 3 months, 4 months, a year? I mean, what do you tell them?
Yeah. So my goal is to lead my students to become confident in their day-to-day interactions with people in their new language in the 3 to 6 month time frame. Sometimes it happens faster, sometimes it happens slower, but that's my personal goal, is to get them comfortable. Now that doesn't mean that they've mastered Spanish, because if I were to tell you I can teach my students how to master the language in 6 months, everybody would be throwing tomatoes at me. But Conversational, like Jason, would you agree that he was conversational in English? Like he was able to understand my questions and respond to them? Not perfectly, but that was only in 2 months. Does that make sense? And I mentioned this earlier, if anybody's interested in teaching reading strategies to their students to complement, first and foremost, I think conversation's the best practice, right? I want my students to go out, I teach them on, I think, the second day of class. The best way to start a conversation is to introduce yourself. So it would be exactly like this. Hola, me llamo David, estoy estudiando español, podemos practicar. And I teach them that, and we start off almost every single class saying that and having my students walk through that introduction. Because if you want to start speaking Spanish, you have to start speaking Spanish. And more than likely, that means you have to introduce yourself to a complete stranger and put yourself out there and go from there, right? But we do it over and over in class, and they don't always go out and do it, but frequently I love it when they come back to class and say, I can't believe it, but I was at Starbucks and somebody was speaking Spanish and I walked up and introduced myself and it worked. They actually invited me to sit down and start talking. And I say that, I always teach them that too, because later in my Spanish studies career, I moved to Argentina. I ended up living there for a year. And I didn't know anybody, and it was really important for me to actually learn the language. And I saw some of my classmates that, they were from the United States and they kind of clicked up with other Americans and they didn't really, integrate into the local culture. So I made that a habit. Every single day, I would go out to a cafe and order a coffee and kind of scan the room. And if I saw somebody that looked like they were kind of hanging out and didn't have a lot going on, I would walk up and say that exact same thing, right? And 99% of the time, it worked. 99% of the time people said, yeah, have a seat, let's talk, right? And so I tell my students to do that, and I'm fortunate. I live in Denver where there's no shortage of Spanish speakers and there's no shortage of English speakers, so they have these opportunities. Almost every time you walk out the door, you're gonna hear both of these languages being spoken in my community. So I think that conversational practice, of course, is key, right? But outside of that, my favorite activity is reading, because, watching TV or listening to the radio, especially as a new student, people are just talking way too fast, and you can't isolate the words, and you can't figure out how to spell them, and then you can't figure out how to look them up in the dictionary. But I think reading really does a great job of this. Because on paper you can actually see, oh, this word starts here and stops here, and then you can get out your dictionary and look it up. But Rice has a really great book about teaching reading strategies in your classes, so highly recommend it. Okay, so last little thing about relevant vocabulary, or learning vocabulary in the first place. I think we've got 4 R's. It's got to be relevant vocabulary, right? And has anybody ever here used Duolingo? Yeah. So I love how Duolingo teaches you how to say the gorilla ate the cat last night. Like, it's not relevant. That's what I mean by relevant. They do it to make it fun and entertaining, but they have completely missed the fact that people don't like that. It's not useful, If people are learning something, they should be able to learn something that they can actually go out and start using right away. Mine from high school was, ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? I've lived in 4 different Spanish-speaking countries, and not once have I visited a library. So, I think it's much more valuable to ask my students if they like to use social media and which is their favorite app and what sport they play. And I remember talking to one of my students, Rafael from Venezuela, and kind of having some of this open-ended conversation with him, and going through like some of my 3 favorite questions to teach are, what do you like to do for fun? What are your interests, and what makes you happy? And with one of those questions, you should see that aha moment where the student all of a sudden lights up. You found something that they like to talk about, and then you just start hammering that, right? So in this situation, he's a big fan of tennis, you know? And so we're speaking English, and all of a sudden he says, oh, I love playing tennis. And so I start trying to think of questions to follow up. I said, okay, how often do you play? You know, I try to go once a week or once a month. Okay, who's your favorite player? Huge grin when I asked him who his favorite player was. And then all of a sudden, he couldn't stop talking. So that's what I mean by relevant, right? Sometimes you have to dig in a little bit, you know, and you can't just use the book. You have to do some customized classes here to find that relevant vocabulary. But once you find it, students get excited about it. And then you repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it. One issue I've always had with Spanish classes is that it just goes way too fast, you know? In my first semester, I started with the simple present tense and ended up on the subjunctive, you know, pluscuamperfecto, and it was just like, you don't ever use that, like hardly ever, you know? I speak Spanish now probably more frequently than I speak English on a day-to-day basis, and sure, you use the subjunctive every now and then, right? But why do we go from, you know, week 1 to month 2 and just beat our students up on this subjunctive stuff that doesn't even exist in our native language, and it's all about hypothetical situations, and it's just so overwhelming for students. So I really like to focus on this stuff and repeat it a whole lot. It's got to be real conversation, and reading is your best friend. Let's see here, just a time check. I've got 7 minutes left, and I know I was supposed to leave some time at the end for open-ended questions and answers, so does anybody have any questions? Or should I keep going? Any questions? Okay. All right, so I'm glad we have time for this. So what is a conversation? All activity should be done from the perspective of a conversation when you're teaching conversation classes. There is a local school, university, kind of a weird private university thing, but they claim to teach conversation classes, and they don't. They teach traditional grammar-based Spanish, but they do it in a small group, and that's what they call conversation. And whenever their students come to me to work, they show me the materials and they tell me what class was like, and sure enough, the teacher was lecturing and they were writing notes while they're in class. That is not a conversation, right? So what is a conversation? It's an informal conversation, an informal talk between 2 or more people where you're exchanging ideas and information. And so when I teach Spanish, this is what that exchange looks like. So one person is starting off with an idea, and we can imagine this person's going to ask this person if they want to eat a burrito, right? Sure enough, they form the question verbally, ¿comes burritos? Now the person has to hear the question, form an idea in response, and then form a verbal response to it. Sí, como burritos. So there's the exchange that's taking place. And I think the verbs are the key component to getting people conversational as quickly as possible. But again, not teaching the full verb chart, right? Tuyo, and getting people really comfortable with this exchange that takes place. Because that's going to be 99% of their conversations, especially in those first few months, right? So I try to get my students thinking about learning their new language from the perspective of asking questions, understanding questions, and forming a response, right? And sure enough, it works pretty well. Let's see here. So, New Year's resolution. Do you think your students are making resolutions to learn how to understand the language? How to read the language, how to write the language? Or how to speak the language? My business of teaching languages in my community, it's kind of like a gym. I get that New Year's resolution like rush. January through March, I don't have a life. And it's people saying, that's my New Year's resolution. I finally want to learn how to speak Spanish, right? So that's what I do with my conversation classes, is try to give my students exactly what they want. And by doing that, I encourage early production, which I know Krashen is not a big fan of it. So if you're a big fan of Comprehensible Input and Stephen Krashen's material, he actually argues against it. And that's the one area that I just completely disagree with, right? Because there's a physiological and a neurological response that has to take place when it comes to learning a new language. Students want to speak the language just as long as they feel comfortable, right? So there's a difference between encouraged speech and forced speech. So this is the paper that Krashen wrote about forced speech, where he's arguing against it. So my interpretation of it is if you're forcing people to do something that they don't feel comfortable with and calling them up in front of class, that's gonna lead to the young lady taking those anxiety pills before she goes to class, right? But if you're doing this in a way to motivate your students, build up their self-confidence, and reduce their anxiety, they're gonna enjoy doing it. And then that's going to get into the physiological response, right? There's over 50 muscles and organs in your face and neck and head that are responsible for producing sounds. And it's like muscle memory. Does anybody play golf? No golfers? Me neither, I'm terrible. I don't know how I do it, but I make the ball go backwards every time. And it's terrible because I don't have that muscle memory. I do not know how to make my body move that way. And the same thing has to take place in somebody's face in order to speak the language. So we converse in class where I lead my students through this type of activity to kind of help them build up this muscle memory. And then last little thing I'll leave you with is by doing this, it's also helping them build up the right neurological pathways in the brain. Because everybody probably knows like right brain and left brain, but it's fascinating to look at this. And these are all the different individual parts of the brain that are responsible for different parts of conversation, right? So when you're teaching somebody a new language on paper, that's what they're learning how to do, right? But when you're conversing, and so if you're on paper, you're maybe activating this visual cortex, right? And probably your motor cortex. So you might be activating two parts of the brain. But when you're speaking the language, you have to activate all of these different parts of the brain all at the same time. So that's why I think it's super critical, super important to learn through conversation so that you're actually creating all this stuff in the brain the way that it should be done from the beginning. Okay, well, I think we're about out of time. This presentation is available to download from the conference's website. And of course, I'd love to hear from you. You can follow me on social media. That's my phone number and email address, so feel free to get in contact. Thank you.